I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And today we have a really interesting, fascinating story, discussion, something that we've never talked about before. Honestly, I didn't really consider talking about until, of course, I met Miss Amanda Schmitt. Now, okay, that's a bit unfair. We've been friends for a long time. We've discussed perhaps having a show for several months now. It's never quite worked. I'm finally able to sit down with her and to talk about something that is very dear to her heart, extremely dear to her heart, and that is the subject of visiting the imprisoned. Now, we're going to learn more about her story, why it's so near and dear to her, why she picked it up in the first place. But first, Amanda, maybe tell everybody a little bit about who you are and where you come from.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. It's a real privilege. Been looking forward to it, but life's been busy, so
Sure.
and I'm kind of perfectionist, so it takes me a while to get to the point. But I would say a lifelong traditional Catholic. My family, my mother came to be to the light, I would say, when I was 4 years old. So I have no memory of the Novus Ordo. She read Father Watson's book, The Great Sacrilege, on a Saturday night, and never went back. So it was significant. I think the most significant part of that story was she had no idea if she would ever go to Mass again. She started writing letters to old priests, and she wrote to the author of the publisher of The Great Sacrilege, and she sat back and waited, said Mass prayers, prayed the Rosary, and 3 months later, she got that phone call and found out that Father Watson actually had a mission 10 minutes from our home.
Okay.
So, it's not, all perfect. He was a Feniite, and, it was early days. He never was a site of the contest. But certainly I grew up with the Latin Mass and a lot of saint stories, and, I don't have any Novus Ordo background except for a lot of relatives.
And it's fairly unusual. I mean, for that rare group of people back in I assume this must have been 70s, 80s. That's pretty incredible for these people who really stood up and said, no, I'm just not going to do it. I mean, and it obviously there weren't that many, but major hat tip to those who did. I mean, just so much bravery. It's incredible.
I think the most significant stories was the first place we went had this modern art. It was a junior achievement building and had this primary colors, red, yellow, modern art, this huge wall, and it had this massive table in the middle and this horrible wall. And my mother's like, do something. And she made this gigantic curtain. It must have been 50 feet long. And she made buttonholes and paper clips, and she would hang that curtain every time.
Okay.
And then the other time, the other thing was the basketball net hanging above the altar, the temporary altar, and her climbing up on the altar and wrapping it up so that it wasn't a proper basketball net above the altar.
Wow. So this was the place that you were having Mass when you were a kid with the older priests.
Yes, this was in our hometown. He did have a chapel in Louisville, and that is one of my fondest memories of my childhood, is getting up before dark and traveling 2 hours to go to the High Mass and all. So I did have that experience.
Oh, that's great. And so from there, I mean, did you live most of your life then at this point in the Midwest, or because I know now you're down in Florida? I mean, but that's fairly recent.
Yeah, I was 30 when we moved to Florida. Okay. So until then it was Southern Indiana.
Got it, Southern Indiana. Because I'm just wondering, you got a bit of an accent, and it's interesting that to me it sounds almost Southern, but it doesn't seem to be Midwestern.
I was around a lot of people from Kentucky. It's a very different culture, but a lot of people I went to church with, we were like right on the river. Half the people crossed the river, So and in Louisville was Kentucky. So, there's a lot of back and forth, but the culture is very different. But we consider ourselves the North, and I think they consider themselves the South. I think.
That's pretty funny. I'll ask Stephen Spur.
I have a very typical.
One of my online buddies. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I've been told I have a very typical Indiana accent.
Okay, Indiana accent, because it sounds. I just get a little bit of that twang, the southern twang. I mean, Stephen Spray is one of my good friends on online, and it reminds me a little bit. He's a little heavier, but anyway, back on topic. So when did you start? When did it start for you to start visiting the imprisoned? Is that something that sprung out when you were young, or what made you start doing that?
Well, it's kind of a process, I would say. I think you could trace the very first seed to reading the life of St. Joseph of Faso when I was 12 or 14. But, I had no intention whatsoever. No, I didn't even correlate that to modern times, at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually not I was a rather haughty traditional Catholic, as time went on. But that was a first seed. That was very, very inspiring to me. I remember trying to get my hands on a relic, and and then going forward throughout my teens. Unfortunately, my family is a spiritual disaster. My brother and sisters are way older than me. My brother 12, 14, 15 years older. My parents were very different. My mother came to tradition as part of a conversion of her life. So when they were growing up, you wouldn't think it, but my mother had the bleach blonde hair and the glued on eyelashes and fangly earrings in the 70s. And, they were, bar hopping all night with friends and going to parties that belonged to the boating club on the Ohio River. And my mother had made a 180-degree turn.
And so your mom's conversion, was there something that caused that, or where did that come from, if you don't mind me asking?
Not really. It was she did have a significant experience when she was in Florida one time, where honestly, the woman seemed to be a prophet. Came to her, like my mom was out in a, swimming suit out on the beach, and this old lady in a dress walks up and puts her hand on her shoulder. Actually, she was out in the water, and says, "My dear, I can feel your suffering. You don't put your trust in God." And then she went on to give advice to my brother and sisters and all about things. She knew things about how they did in school and stuff that there was no way to know it. Like she told my brother really struggled in school, and, just the dyslexic type, and she said, "You do better than him in school. You should help him," and some different things that she told. And then she said, "My shoulder hurts. I have to go. When my shoulder hurts, my husband needs me." And my mother never paid attention. My dad said, "Yeah, she was wearing a long dress, and she walked out in the water holding her dress." But it didn't have any real effect. But it was about a year later, and my mom she said it was like I was down in a pit, and I wanted out. So of course she got real involved in the Novus Ordo. Like not involved, but like trying to go to the Novus Ordo every day, take my brother to serve mass. And then she started asking questions. Why this? Why that? And stuff the pastor said was only making it much worse.
And did she grow up as a Catholic, or why did she go straight to the Novus Ordo?
My mother was born in 1938. They got married in 1958. So, yeah, and she had old parents. So, yes, they were very much in full Catholic high school before any of the changes.
Gotcha. And so by the time you were 4, then she had obviously changed her mind a bit and decided that Vatican II and the church was not church.
She said, at time, I thought I didn't care if they put a purple Buddha on the altar. And while they were changing things, I thought, well, they get rid of confession because I didn't really like it. So she just, whatever they're doing, she didn't care, part of their social life was going to dances and drinking parties, beer stoops at the church. The pastor was I don't know if he was of the Bush beer family or not, but this wealthy Bush family, and he actually got shut down by the city for throwing beer stoops that were a public nuisance.
Wow, you can't make this stuff up, huh?
That's a priest that baptized me. But he was actually conservative, an old conservative priest.
I mean, I'm a fan of beer, but let's keep these things in moderation here. Right? I don't know
This
about
was
a
not
priest
my,
throwing parties. It's
my mom's like, yeah, you be dancing outside of the church with a drunk person that goes to church with you, and the way he's behaving, and you're afraid to go to communion the next day. That's
crazy.
what, and then in their boating club, a couple of their friends, the two brothers that were both in the club, they got divorced and they married each other's wives. I mean, things were just getting really, really raunchy when she escaped the life she was in.
Crazy.
And
And
unfortunately,
that's fortunate.
but unfortunately, my father never gave up his worldly mindset, and it was a bit too late for my brother and sisters. And while they got to be traditional Catholic, they all got married by Father Watson. I watched all my nephews get baptized, and I put a huge amount of effort into them. And I was only 10 when my first nephew was born, so they were super, super precious to me. 7 boys and then 2 girls on the end. And to watch them all go down, it's just incredibly tragic. And I saw a lot of, unfortunately, almost all of the young people that I grew up with fell away. Some thankfully did come back, but it was spiritual carnage that I watched. So many traditional Catholics throw their faith out for the world. My family's they're very worldly kind of people. All that matters is how you look and what your money you make and that sort of thing. Um,
That's
so
not just your family, though. That's the
yeah,
world
I
in
know.
general, right? That's unfortunately the majority of us. I mean, I don't want to
Yeah,
exclude myself in that for sure. I mean, it's tough. It's a
yeah.
tough world. I mean, the world and the devil have stacked it against us to
Mhm.
stay the straight and narrow.
Yeah. And so seeing, it makes you very desperate to see at a certain point because there's almost no focus in the traditional movement on anything except Catholics and mostly our relatives and our friends. And that's a very small pool of souls. And many times they are just simply not interested. And I begin to feel like we were like a lot of traditional Catholics are like the chosen people. They would not go to the wedding feast and they were cast into the exterior darkness. And they're so sure that, I've got to be better than everybody else no matter what I do. And you know what the servants God told to do? They're told to go out in the streets and lanes of the cities and then into the highways and hedges. And that was the other second big thing. That was the biggest thing that pushed me to go into the prison. So I'll just take it here. These don't want it. I'll take it there and see if they want it.
And so, how old were you when you started doing that?
Well, there's a big gap there. I was 42
Okay.
because that was when after my mother died, which my home life with
Mm-hmm.
my mother that would be for a whole nother discussion. But she was, there's certain ways that some homeschooling parents take things very extremely to a mind control level. And unfortunately, that was the case with my family. So I was kind of stuck there and I wasn't really allowed any autonomy. So that's something I'm kind of working through ever since their death when it's just, and thankfully with the situation with my family by that point, the divorces and everything and remarriages, and they were like gone by that point. So, I was taken care of, but I do have to, it's been a learning curve.
Sure.
But
It sounds like
the
it. That's
first
tough.
thing I did was to immediately, I also, well, wait a minute, there's a third thing. There was another big key I skipped over. Besides seeing the family and all that, I actually, as a teenager, was like I say, very haughty and very intolerant. I did not see the American people as having souls, or the people in society as souls at all. I didn't think about that. We went to Mexico. I so much wanted to move there and forget this place existed, or get 100 acres and live in the middle of it and forget society existed. And just going in public, I would have this angry contempt sometimes my mom said, "Why were you looking angry? There's a person with all these tattoos or long hair, earrings." I was totally intolerant. And that climaxed with this is very significant. This neighbor who lived across the road, long story short, his arms were tattooed all the way up. His arms were green. His head was shaved. He didn't have a driver's license. Your classical drug addict loser, Parents divorced, Catholics mixed in there. And I don't, the lady was Cuban, or the stepmother was Cuban. His dad was from Indiana. I don't know why this particular person, I absolutely could not stand this person. I just despised this person. I mean, the Cuban side of the family is actually more annoying, but for some reason I found them more tolerable, like their personality or something. And so then, this guy got in a little trouble with the police, didn't see him a while, was so glad he was gone. They happened to have moved in the house where we moved to Florida. It was a brand new house, and we rented it for a year, bought the property across the road. So I'm looking in our house that was like neat and perfect when we left, and now he's not mowing the grass, and So didn't see him a while, and I looked out the window one day, and they're straight across the road, and I see him in the garage, and I'm very let down. I thought Chris was out of the picture. The next day, I watched a 3-hour death investigation, and I watched them carry his body out in a body bag. This guy happened to be my age, which was, made the whole situation more striking. And it's one reason I was intolerant of his behavior.
Right.
Am I still through okay? Because you kind of froze.
You're good. Yeah, I'll fix it. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was such a striking scene, and it went on all afternoon, and I was so struck by where was he now? I mean, no doubt there was nothing could be, but he had just passed through the same judgment that I feared, with nothing that I've had. He had the same. He didn't cease to exist. Where was he now? Very little chance that he wasn't in hell. And what I had compared to him. So that I have never been the same from that day. I completely changed 180 degrees as to how I saw people of that class and that society in general. They have souls, very much as the same souls that we have. And we are the privileged ones that are forgetting and complain about their behavior, but what are we doing to give them the light that we have? So this was just one of those turn you around, grab you and turn you around completely moments. And then, it was a time in between there. I was 33, I think, at the time. And then when my mother died, in between there, I had very different sentiments ever since that day. And I had seen where you could write to prisoners. And also, when my mother died, it was a very life-changing event, obviously, and very extremely painful. And I didn't feel like I'd ever be happy again. And that was really the point where I gave my will over to God and said, it's okay. If I feel like this the rest of my life, it's okay as long as I save my soul. And there's a lot of things I had thought through the years I might do, but really there was hardly anything I felt like I wanted to do now. But I said I'm going to do whatever I feel is God's will I do. And I jumped in, and it wasn't long, and I was happier than I'd ever been. But
It's amazing how that works, huh?
I sent that first letter to prison in September, which was about 6 weeks after my mother died. I mean, I didn't lose any time. As soon as I settled all the affairs, I jumped in.
What struck you to do that? I mean, was there something was it on your mind already to get involved in the?
Well, I've seen online where there were prisoners asking for people to write to them, the pen pal sites, and then I got the idea that it could be done. And it's just hard to go reach out to society. What are you going to do? Go in the mall, poke somebody on the arm and say, let's have a deep spiritual conversation. I mean, I'm not doing the Jehovah's Witness deal, just not. And where else can you say, hey, you want to talk about the faith? And I'm very straightforward. I just said, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. Do you want it? Do you want to talk about this? And so, it just was like kind of an opportunity, and it fit those lost souls that I was ready to take them on.
And so in those letters, did you write so forwardly? Were you like, hey, I'm Amanda, I'm a traditional Catholic?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Write me back if you're interested. Yeah.
Yep. That's how I did it.
Cool.
And I got the same thing straight back. And that's probably one of the most striking things that it was a couple of things I would say the most striking was, the attention that they were getting directly from God, which was very obvious, which was more direct than what we usually experience because we have the church, we have sermons, we have books. And I found that God was just in there just directly talking to them, not just, but yeah, much more direct experiences and things that they would describe in very Catholic, very much in accord with Catholic doctrine. And sometimes you can figure this out, and the people out here can't figure this out. And sometimes Catholics can't even figure it out. They could have things very straight. And you're talking to some, kid that's mom was a prostitute. He's a gang member. He's been sitting in prison since he's 17, most of those years in a box, solitary confinement, extreme situations. And you're like, hey, I can carry on a better conversation with you, like the people I go to church with sometimes. So that was amazing, the deep thinking, because, they have a lot of time to think, and there's not all the distractions. And there's many times there's hours of solitude, and, I did not expect to go in that deep, straight in, you're thinking there may not be so bright. I found more very bright people. I won't say I found a lot of common sense. Dusty is an exception to that rule. But I don't say common sense abounded, but straight up IQ levels, they tend to be, what I ran into, the people I chose tended to be high IQ.
And so could you choose, and so on these websites, did you have like a profile that you could choose from? Or?
Yeah. Yes, and I would skip through all the ones just looking for girlfriends and stuff and pick particular ones. The first person I wrote to was a male witch that I looked him up, and I found out he had a desperate hatred for the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Significant, though, he did not retaliate on me. He didn't answer. I think I wrote back, and he handed his letter to Lauren Cole, his friend. These two were on death row. And just recent, Lauren Cole, he didn't hang on. He was afraid that there would be drama because of other prisoners. If I was writing to anyone else, he wouldn't write. But just recently, Damien Arthur had contacted me about a year ago, and he's actually been writing to him for a year now. Okay. So that first letter that was to the witch, he handed this guy the letter. So, that was a kind of a win, because this guy did hate the Catholic Church. I mean, I read that he grew up with pentagrams and everything in the house as a child. And I'm like, I want to go take this to somebody that's the most needy. And also what Dusty was, it said he was pagan. So, the little box you could tick, death row and life. And Protestant, they're just as bad in there as so pagans, let's go there. So that's
and so I have to ask you, you've mentioned Dusty a few times now, so you got to tell us who's Dusty.
Okay, so Dusty was either the first or the second person to respond. I didn't know it was going to be significant, and I was blown away by his humility and straightforwardness, which the straightforwardness is another characteristic of prisoners. They don't have that social bubble because obviously he's been shattered. But he was so humble and so straightforward. It was like you got a letter from the 1500s, is how I would describe it. I didn't even know people could be like that anymore. So I wrote him a 5-page letter back, typed, 5 pages. I never heard anything back. I couldn't believe it. It was just very distressing because this had me completely enthused. This was the greatest thing ever. And, it ended, please share your knowledge of the Catholic faith with me. And he was actually looking for, he said he wanted prayer partners, just a little box you could tick. And I wasn't really very nice in the first letter. I said, I don't know why you want prayer partners, because if you're a pagan. Well, what he explained, he had been in shamanism, but he had given up like the occult parts and was more just like looking for the creator, more of a natural religion, which then I explained that to him. But he said he wanted prayer partners so people could explain why they thought their religion was the true one, and then he could make his decision. So I wrote this 5-page letter back and never heard anything until 3 months later. I get a letter that he had a friend mail out because they were throwing his mail all away due to his lawsuits. He's a kind of self-made attorney. He's quite successful in federal court, and they don't like that because they have to change policies sometimes. So they were committing the federal offense of throwing his mail away. I knew that when I got that letter, the problem was he didn't tell me how to recontact him. And he was like, I don't know why you never responded. I'm sorry if I offended you some way, but I wish you the best. I don't hold it against you or anything. But I know God will break this wall down somehow. I trusted. It took me a month doing everything, like sending a little book from Amazon and that little note, and I put my phone number, all these little ways, and it's just still. And finally, somebody said, talk to his social worker. And she went down, she told him, jig's up, and there's never been a problem since.
Okay.
So, but he was always different. I'll tell you a little more. The other ones were, there is a tendency to see a lot of mental illness, very smart people. And I'm talking about crazy people, but just emotionally very immature people. And the one problem I ran into was, and I didn't know it was a problem, was a lot of mommy stuff. They weren't younger than me, but that was the relationship. And I was eating it up, to be honest.
Okay.
35-year-old men that think they're little kids, and down the road, the behavior doesn't necessarily, they won't take responsibility for their actions, and they'd run into some real trouble with them getting in trouble. I had major problems with because he kept getting himself in trouble and me bailing him out, and yeah, because he was.
I wonder if that would be the case. I mean, because obviously you must have some sort of a risk in having not relationships, but even friendships or any sort of connection with him, because they are in prison.
Yes, and I went to Dusty to have snatched me out of some situations I shouldn't have been in. There was mostly one in particular. He was very young and very, early 20s, and looked like he was 15, small guy in Florida, which is, they're hideous. The Florida prisons, the southern prisons are hideous. And he was very mentally ill, very brilliant with words, but even very abused as a small child. And he was diagnosed with 5 different mental illnesses when he was 5. So he was a case to deal with, and he was very confusing. But he kept he would take drugs on loan from high-ranking gang members, and they told me he was going to get killed. And it's probably, some of it was true. I saw the physical evidence, but and then after a while, he started making it up. And then one day he was a saint, and honestly, it was sincere. He knew too much, but he had a borderline personality disorder, so it would switch out, and I wasn't there to see the switch. I could tell it, but the letters I got, but yeah, because again, I think he would be out 3 months. I was wrong. He was out 2.5 months, and he's back in jail. So yeah, and Dusty had to finally kind of lay an ultimatum with me that I better keep away because he could show up at my door, and I had to admit, yes, I'd be very afraid if he did, because he was very, very unstable. So yes,
and these men that you write, I mean, do you feel like what's the most contributing factor to their crimes or their mental illness? Is it abuse as a child? Is it lacking parents? Is it?
The ones I dealt with mostly came from very, very bad backgrounds. That one's mother was, his grandmother was Catholic. She was kind of a decent person. Moved to Florida into horrible glamour, wealthy, money, drugs, women, prostitutes, guns, into this neighborhood. And the one uncle was good. The other son went out and got involved on the streets with some woman that turned out to be a 13-year-old girl. And this girl was a monster. It's his mother. I mean, they did everything you could do to a child before his grandmother finally got the welfare and finally got the nerve to take him away and adopted him. But then she adopted the other kids, and they were still doing all these horrible things to him. Another one, and I haven't fully given up on this one because he's actually an okay guy to deal with, even if he is like he's 7 at times. His mother, he grew up in Reno in Los Angeles on the streets. His mother was a prostitute. His grandmother was the most sensitive. She was a gypsy, running a night because she had gotten burned in a defective car and won $1 million. So she started all these nightclubs and whatever. She's in a wheelchair, but then she spent all the money. And so gypsy, wild, that's the grandma. And then the dad's side, well, the dad, he was absent because the mom was just a prostitute. She was homeless most of the time. They would put him in a home and he'd run away back to his mom, and they lived in the cars. He would tell the wildest stories, and he was actually real good to talk to, but a very deep understanding of God and Mary and everything. You couldn't believe it, but the kid had you could write a wild novel, just his normal life. Like, he had no background of any sane background at all. Another one, it was similar. His mother was kidnapped in Miami. One of those horrific cases where they kidnap a child, take them somewhere else, and do horrible things to them. And they were holding a ransom because they thought the family had money. They didn't, but they thought it. And eventually she did one of these escape deals where she, but then he took the child. Like, she was going to go in the got him to take her back to Miami, and she was going to go in the gas station and try to escape. She said she was going to kill him if she got a chance, if that's what it took. But he wouldn't let her take the child in. He took the child to Texas, and he ended up chopped up on the Rio Grande. That was what I was told. I mean, these were like children growing up in completely unbelievable situations. And Dusty did not have that kind of a horrific young childhood. His life went off the rails. It started really going off when he was 10 or 12. So he has actually an old-fashioned kind of background with his grandparents, had a lot of influence. So he has that kind of solid small town, wasn't allowed to run in the house and all that stuff. So, I wouldn't be able to relate to him like I do if he'd had the background that these other ones did.
But he still had, as you say, he had enough of a bad childhood that's really what affects it. And it's something that you really got to wonder. You hear about packed prisons, and you hear about the mistreatment and all that's going on, and look at the drugs, and look at the murders and the crime in Chicago, Atlanta, and all these cities. It's like, I really do wonder. I mean, what is it that we have to do to try to fix this? I mean, as a society, and it really makes me think about the whole thing in general. When you look at back in the day, the church was really in charge of, they're the ones who visited the imprisoned and visited the sick and took care of the sick and raised taught the children. And since that's all gone away, it's the state doing it. And look what happens when the state starts to, take care of the imprisoned, and the state starts to care for the sick. For goodness sake, we can talk about that for a year, right? And it's a disaster. And it's seeing what happens.
The system is designed to have the exact amount. We have more people incarcerated per capita in the United States than any country in the world, higher than communist China. And it is designed to trap them into the situation where they keep coming back to prison. You would not believe, that would be a whole different podcast to say what it is exactly like. The prison system is is designed to force people as much as they can to fail.
Well, you hear the stories of Kamala Harris, and I mean, she literally held people longer than they were allowed to be held, and she kept people in prison to work as her slave labor in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is known stuff. And if that's one story, one example, I mean, come on, what are these people doing?
They get like Wisconsin gets I think it's like 200,000 or something a year for Dusty, but I can tell you they don't spend that on him. In federal grants per prisoner, and then they get it distributed as they like.
Crazy. Yeah, tell me that makes sense. So our taxpayer dollars are going to the government, who pays them to somebody, maybe paid themselves for it, and then, as you say, then the prison systems themselves don't get fixed.
I will give you, for instance, of how horrific it at the personal level. Dusty was. It was a horrific wait for a surgery on his knee. It was completely disconnected. It was very extensive surgery. It was to the point where he was falling on his head just to get out of bed, and when he had the surgery, one particular officer decided to torture him, and he was in such an agony of pain trying to walk, and the one officer specifically tried to torture him. Like, he told him his cellmate couldn't come get his food tray, but he was on 2 crutches and told him not to walk, put any pressure. How are you going to carry a food tray? They would leave him standing outside in the cold, and it was just horrific. Well, it turns out it wasn't long, and that Dusty's telling me that officer's going to get beat up because he went and taken another lifer's everything he had just on, well, you didn't have a receipt, or you didn't. And sure enough, he got beat up. And wasn't long after that, we heard that he was being investigated for sexual assault on the prisoners. And then recently, another officer was telling Dusty that this prison guard was one of 4 Milwaukee officers that were arrested for pulling over black people and strip searching them for no reason on the side of a highway. The other 3 went to prison. This one got off because he gave information on the other 3. So he got fired from the police department and now has a job and is doing the same thing to the prisoners. Crazy. This is corrections.
Crazy. Yeah, well, it sounds like government in a nutshell, right? I mean, this is the decision making of the state, right?
Yeah.
Crazy. So I mean, I guess the question becomes, how is that something that we can, as Catholics, help? And I really appreciate, as you said, what you did in writing these prisoners, because it is, I'd say you got to be careful, obviously. And I'd say anyone watching this, if you're a young person, I just wouldn't do it. I'd say, make sure you're very mature. You're mentally able to have conversations with people who are in prison. But I mean, I'm sure there are souls, as you said, these are souls who need guidance even sometimes, or help, or friends.
Yes, I would say gotta be careful of the mommy thing. Like, when Dusty came into a relationship with me, we had formed a close friendship over the years, and he was different. He was never that immature way. I started leaning on him a bit. He was always very different. And when we actually decided, let me get a chance to tell that later, on a personal relationship, the strict dad came on the scene. And that changed things a lot. A lot of things where I was putting up with, we weren't putting up with anymore. And that, I ended up seeing the entire, parable of the sower play out. And then Dusty's strictness, thinned things down. But that applied to everybody on the outside too, not just prisoners. Mm-hmm. But I would say, as far as anybody would be interested in it, number one, you never, ever give backdoor money. I don't care if the person is going to get killed. They might get killed. You don't do it. You don't go down that road. There's a proper way. If you want to give them money, there's a proper way, proper accounts. There's a way it's done. You do not give it to somebody's brother, friend, and then once that starts, it doesn't end. And they have to stop putting there's like a way you live in there, because it's anarchy in a lot of places, and you have to handle it. And sometimes it's a very violent situation, but you can't start saving somebody. That was the biggest. It is quicksand, and yes, I ended up talking to gang members on the phone on the outside, and it was scary. I had a night or so that I was terrified. And that's just something, that door stays tightly shut no matter what. It is a red flag if the person you're talking to is very free asking for anything, even legitimately, because the good ones will be very shy about that. You almost sometimes have to push it on them because they do have needs. They're not taken care of. They do have needs, but you know, a lot of prisoners, it's something you can get somebody to write to, especially if it's a woman, and then your needs are taken care of. You know, it's kind of like a job. You know, like, it's a kind of a friendship, but it's, you know, and you know, the good ones, they loathe that, and they don't want to be seen as that. I mean, you think in the first years, Dusty got less than anybody else, ironically. I didn't get anything for a long time. Well, he got that typewriter that I got him a typewriter right away after I realized what was wrong with his hands, and he was going to struggle to write to me with his damaged hands, and he was speechless when I told him I would buy him a typewriter.
Cool.
But so asking for money, you know, if they're young and stupid, it doesn't mean it's a complete condemnation, but it is a red flag, because the more honest they are, the more they're not going to ask. The other thing is, and this would really be good for anybody on social media or anything, please be prepared. If you got to study your faith for 2 years, more at the seminary level, you will need more than just a catechism, basic catechism, because they are deep thinkers. A lot of them are smart, and they will take you into very heavy apologetics immediately. And it may be that little 22-year-old gangster off the street. You don't think, never underestimate the mind. And you will be, you know, it's no, like if and I dealt with some Protestants, and they were no different than the Jehovah's Witness showing up at your door, you know, and going into about the church fathers and everything. You'll have the same exact conversations you have with someone else, only with a whole lot more attention, brains put into it, a lot more thought. You're going to go in real deep, real quick. So
you know what's incredible as you say this? This is really striking me in a different way, is that you're saying how kind of bright and intelligent and well thought these people are. It's like, you know, can you imagine now if we didn't have our cell phones and didn't have our distractions? I mean, how well could we argue and study and think? This is blowing my mind right now, thinking that in some ways these people in prison have it better than we do, because they actually have time to contemplate God.
They do. The one I was telling you, the young one that the mother was a prostitute in Reno and Los Angeles and all. Right before I met him, and I haven't given up on him yet. Right before I met him, he had spent 6 years in solitary confinement. He was 17 at the time of the crime, which he was drinking. They were in a gang. It was a fast action. Doesn't halfway know how it even happened. It was between gang members, and he was he was never even involved in gang stuff in the prison. But that was the policy. They have very brutal policies like that in California. He was put in solitary confinement for 6 years. I said, no, you need to have a Bible. He said, but God was always so good to me. He said, I could always feel his presence, like he was just right here with me. He said, my heart stopped every time I blinked my eyes when God was with me. And he also told me that, he said, I always knew I had a woman. This is the kind of enlightenment. I always knew I had a woman watching over me. He said, I'd have these dreams where I'd be running like from witches and cauldrons and all that kind of thing. And I'd be running from it. And then I would come to this white mantle with gold, and they would all flee the other way. And he said, then when I read it in the Bible where Jesus on the cross says, behold thy son, and I knew that's what he gave her to us for our mother. And that's the woman that's been watching over me. Of course, people read that in the Bible, and the prophet says, oh, that just meant St. John was supposed to take her. How's this kid with no background? He also had the experience, and I will tell you, his IQ is like 135, and it's very obvious when you're talking to him. Because I brought it up to him before he told me. But he was taken to the Novus Ordo when he was 11. And he was so overcome by this sense of horror in evil that he got dizzy and sick and had to leave. The Novus Ordo literally made him sick. And they were like, oh, that's devils in you or something. He said, neither, there's something wrong in there.
Right. No kidding.
So, so that would be the other thing. Make sure you're very well prepared. Your basic catechism is not going to cut it. So that would be the other thing, no backdoor money, and be very well prepared, and be aware if they start telling you their needs and they really could you possibly put some money on my account, don't do that too easily. Because you don't want to waste your time. You could give it to somebody that's worth it. To somebody that's just, I ran into some of that, very, very well behaved. Show up every time for the class, and I thought, because I got way too generous in the first years, and I wasn't really, and I started demanding, I got to get something coming back here. I can't just show up and then take care of you, because you showed up politely on time, So,
No, it's pretty incredible too. That one of the, it's a subject that I honestly don't think about often, but it's really been kind of on my mind for a few months now, especially since I imagine most people here watching this read the letter. I'm sure you could tell me the name of the prisoner who wrote about Bishop Dolan.
Joseph Murphy. Dusty just reminded me of his name.
Okay.
So what's his name? Yeah.
It's great. It's an incredible letter. I'll try to find the link and attach it to this video, because it really shows how a soul can be saved. Really any soul, as you said earlier. You almost your instinct, our fallen human nature thinks of them as lesser and thinks of them as being below us, and it's so wrong. And they are, as you said, they're children of God, and they'll go to heaven or hell too.
People on the outside have done something worse. Your college professors teaching atheism are worse than any murderer in the prison.
Fair point. Yeah, sure.
And not to mention, when it comes to murderers, standing in the grocery, the lady in front of you might have had 5 abortions and knew it. I dealt with a woman prisoner that, she really did think it was a good idea to shoot her husband. That was the best way out of a very bad situation. But then, and they let her off, but then she hit the second boyfriend with a car and killed him. And they threw the book at her, but prior to this, she had 7 abortions. Tell me it doesn't, there's not a connection,
Crazy.
But, yes, and I do want to tell a little more about Dusty too.
Please, tell us about Dusty.
Yeah, so you said you want to know his story. Well, his story starts out that, obviously he's from a small town in Wisconsin, country boy. Was actually on the honor roll. Really wasn't a problem child or anything. He was a broken family, divorced parents and all that. But he had a solid background with his there was a lot of alcoholism, so his grandparents were separated. But over that, actually, I think that's a significant thing to say, because I see, people get too light about alcohol. And Dusty's very strict about alcohol. He just will not brook the abuse of alcohol. because it's wreaked so much havoc and been the kind of the starting point in his family. His 2 or 3 teenage uncles got killed at once when they've all been out drinking, and their friend thought it'd be cool to race a train, and they all got killed on impact. The friend survived, but all the 2 uncles, I think it was, got killed on impact. His grandfather was a Green Beret medic that had been in combat behind enemy lines in Vietnam, 2 or 3 tours of duty, and he was still standing, still living a normal life, but losing his 2 sons to train wreck. He went over to alcohol, and as long he lost his marriage because his grandmother his wife could live with him. So a lot of destruction there from the abuse of alcohol. But the man still maintained the character that he had, and he passed a lot of solid character on to Dusty. So things were not, they were divorced. His mom was working all the time, and she did drink and stuff. So it wasn't great. And Dusty was basically raised by his sister, who was 8 years older. But there was a lot of influence of the grandmother and grandfather, and so it wasn't like horrible. But then his father came back into his life. They didn't really have much to do with him. He was from definitely a low-life family, and he got into drugs first from a doctor because of his back, then to getting all the painkillers off the street, and then cocaine off the street. He ended up thinking it was a good idea. Well, first of all, Dusty saw him try to commit suicide, literally watched him overdose on purpose. They called the ambulance, and the kids did. That was something he had to watch when he was 11 years old. He's just telling me that today again. And then when he was 10, he told Dusty he was going to start working with a biker gang. I don't tell too many details. But, and that he ended up in a very bad situation and basically handed over his children. So Dusty was 14 and his sister was 15. And it ended up very badly for a person who was also in the same situation. So very tragic on all sides. Dusty is he says I'm too soft on him because, he was only 14 and none of this was his choice. But it was his choice because he made the choice to go along. He wanted to save his family. So he went along to work with these people. And the person that died, she did not deserve what she got. She did not deserve to die. It did come to a life or death situation, but everybody was at fault, and
he was 14.
He was 14. And, but he's very remorseful, and he's very insistent that he will not do anything that will cause family. He would rather die in prison than do anything that will cause that family any more suffering. So, any avenues where he could appeal a case or something that's going to require, everything being dug up, and he's just like, do not care, I will not. I will not put that family through any more suffering. So and he takes full responsibility for everything that happened. He'll say, you're going to soft soap everything, and and you're going to make things not to be like it is, but yeah.
And he's got life.
He was charged as an adult. He never told the story of what happened due to other circumstances, and he just pled guilty and took 30 years to life. Now they're changing the laws, so once the law changes, it's on the books for January. He could come home in a couple of years if the judge decides. Okay. He will be eligible to go. So that's what we're praying. God willing. But more important than how he got there, I think, is how his life turned out once he did. So he was 15 when he was incarcerated, 16 when he was sent to Green Bay Correctional Institution, which is about the toughest prison, adult prison in Wisconsin, which is called Gladiator School. And, you know, he hadn't run in security. He was a big boy, and his grandfather had taught him some Vietnam self-defense tactics. So, you know, he was very capable to defend himself. So he did a lot of fighting. Is that he defended himself more than adequately, and he foresaw any problems and neutralized them. And, you know, so that was the life that he had for the first 8 years or so. And then, so his conversion story goes over a period of 10 years to where he's at now. So he, around age 23, something like that, he had a call from God, very distinct call from God. He had gotten into shamanism because he's good portion Native American. But family's nominal Christian, baptized. That was not his family. He got into that and got rather deeply involved in it. But so he's in one of their meditation states, and he had a series of like revelations of hell, which he described as the state. I say it's hell, but he said it was the state, the hard state of his soul, if it would be what it would become if he stayed on the path he was on. And then he had another thing that he describes, which would be equivalent to purgatory, which was a place of indescribable suffering, but there was something good to be gained from it, and he felt he wanted to go there. And then the third was where he says he met God, which is like a tiny glimpse of the beatific vision, and his overwhelming presence of power and forgiveness and mercy and love and all things he said he had never, like he was sitting in this nothingness and he saw this light or spark and his feeling of this presence. And he said what struck him most is God didn't come with a deal. He didn't want anything from him. It just came of his goodness. And he said everything else, every other being or whatever he dealt with, they always wanted something from you. Everybody wanted something from you in return. And God did not wasn't coming to get something, you know. But he wasn't quite ready, because he's a stubborn boy. And, you know, he didn't turn God down, but he wasn't ready yet. So it was about a year later, all hell broke loose, you might say. First of all, his sister died, which was actually a homicide because she knew too much. So she was purposefully overdosed. So then they were like twins. She's only 10 months older than him. He got very ill. It was back when they were having one of the pandemics, swine flu, I think. Collapsed. They took him to the hospital, brought him back. Didn't get any better. Ended up with pneumonia. Second time they took him back, they didn't bring him back home or back to the prison. And they ended up with a cancer diagnosis. Which at that point, he said, I told him, they said it wasn't too advanced. Thyroid cancer wasn't too advanced. It wouldn't take too much to cure it. He said, I told him to have a nice day. I was ready to die. He told his family to forget about him, go on with their life. And that was his mindset. And, well, when he finally did get back out of the hospital, he gets challenged to one last fight, which is prearranged, and they have officers on hand. They know this is going to happen. It was a taunt. He says it was over a $1 bar of soap, but it was gang members, and everything means something in prison, you know. But they had the fight, and he, of course, won, and he put the person in a coma, and he shattered his hands, and got put in solitary confinement. And at that point, they kind of told him, we might just put you up at the Supermax, which basically means put you in a box and throw away the key for maybe 10 years or so. So he's dying of cancer. His hands are shattered. They did not treat his hands. He literally had to re-break his own hands and try to put them back together. He can barely feed himself. He just put somebody in a coma over a bar of soap. And he just lost his sister, and he's 4 months in SEG, they call it, solitary confinement. And that's when he finally turned to God. And he said he didn't know why God would forgive him, but he asked God to forgive him. And then when he got out, his mom visited, and he said he realized she was afraid to sit by him. He said, I looked in the mirror and I saw what everybody else did, a monster. And he promised his mother he'd never raise his hands to anybody unless his life was in danger, and he has kept that. He has not been in a single fight. He's had jobs and stuff that require the very lowest security rating in the place, carrying tools and stuff. And he started doing every kind of self-help, personal development, everything that he could do to try to develop his mind to, be the best person he can be. And I dropped out of the sky 4.5 years into it and wrote that letter, and we went from there.
And so how long ago was that?
5.5 years ago, going on 6 years ago.
Okay.
It will be 6 years in September.
Yeah.
And, and from there, he was just he has the most angelic eyes. He's got this choir boy way, especially in those early years. When I would talk, his eyes would be so big. And, well, I guess I should tell about how when he actually made his final decision was rather dramatic because, he's been fooled a lot. He's been, a lot of traders and everything in his life, so he's very cautious. So it was about, after we had that space, and it was a full year, but we had that 3 months where we were out of contact. Finally, when he said he saw that, the infallibility of the Pope was necessary, I think he's ready. So, I asked him, and, I sent in a letter if he thought he was ready to make that decision, and he said, I don't know if I can. I have trust issues. And I said, you mean God or people? And he said, probably both. And he was just all dejected, I'm like, okay, I need to go to Wisconsin and go sit down and we'll talk, and we will, that was the first time I walked into prison. And we'll just clear up every question and we'll just get this done. I knew I was going to get this sold when I went in there. It was like going in Walmart to buy, bath towels. I mean, they're in there. And so I couldn't have wanted to go anywhere more than to go in that prison in Green Bay. And, he listened so intently, his nose would turn white. Like he locked eyes and he had this list of questions in his head. And he finally got to his point, and he said he asked me what it meant to like bow to God, and I tried to explain in terms that it could be understood. And he said, I think I've already done that. And he said, I think I'm ready to take the next step. And he's never looked back. The next day it was just, what Bible should we use and how do I teach other people? And he's never looked back.
That's awesome. And so now, so does he have access to, I guess maybe not the sacraments? Does he get visited by priests, or is that in the works, or?
It's in the works. You can see, this is also significant. As I said, I had gotten into kind of I won't say I got into it. I was kind of raised in a semi-home alone situation. Because I only go to the old priests, and in the beginning there was a lot of them, but they kept getting fewer and fewer as they died off, So when I met him, well, actually I went to India to go to Mass after my mother died, to Father De Silva, as the last priest that I knew very well personally. And I went to India. I had not been to Mass in 7 years because my parents got where they couldn't travel. And so Dusty, I was talking to Dusty from India, he was in the scene, and, kind of going through all this process with me. And then I started going to Father, I can't think of his name, in Texas. The old priest at St. Jude's Shrine. Father, it's just blanking out for some reason. But it's St. Jude's Shrine in Texas. Campbell, Father Lewis Campbell. So, I was going to Texas about every 2 months, from Florida to Texas, to go to Mass. And once we decided to pursue a personal relationship, which I started seeing that, but I was afraid to say it to Dusty, and he started seeing it, and he was afraid to say it to me. So it took a little bit he actually pushed me to, to, to ask what I wanted to ask. He kept saying it until I started feeling like I was lying, so I went ahead and asked him if this was a possibility. But I'd already talked to my sister. He'd already talked to friends. I don't want to say anything because of the circumstances. But so that was the first thing he did, was to tell me that I had to get going to Mass. And he is the reason I'm here. He's the reason I'm going to Mass here. I knew that I needed to do more research, but I don't know why. The pressure wasn't there. And I didn't think I was going to get my questions answered. In my family, we knew everything. And I didn't know there was somebody that knew more. Twitter was a help because I did get acquainted with other people. So I knew where I was looking, but he was like, it can't be that there's just one old priest. And to accomplish our future goals, because we had already, had been talking about things we would do, for years. And he's just started putting on the pressure. And I'm like, finally, I'm like, Dusty, give me 10 days. It took me 10 days of intense research, and your dad was part of that research. And he was pushing me. I'm like, Dusty, give me till Friday. I will go to Mass somewhere Sunday. I've got to do my research. And so that was the first thing that he really pushed me forward, and he's continued that in other aspects of my life. I don't know where I would be without. He's a very manly. It's incredible that he does a better job at playing the husband role, even where he's at. And in those aspects, watching over me, pushing me, guiding me, when I want to accomplish something, it's hard for me to get the basics and sequence of the business. He's done all this stuff. Everything's basically due to him. He's the engine behind me, and he's the structure, the organization. So he got me going to Mass here, and he actually is the one got me to move here, and he didn't even tell me to, but I had just got myself into such a situation with the business. I was just stubbornly insisting on staying where I was, thought my roots were too deep. I was driving 200 miles every Sunday after I started going to Mass here. But that wasn't the big deal. It's just God kept throwing roadblocks in front of me, hurdles and finally there was just too many of them, and I was becoming not the person that he could deal with. So he was ready to part ways with me in December. It took me less than 24 hours after he told me that, and I knew he was serious, to know I was going to shut down the business the way it was, and I was coming to Brooksville. Because I knew I had my personal and spiritual well-being first, now, and not in some dreamy future while I killed myself in the meantime. I knew if I was going to come back, that's what I had to do. So it took less than 24 hours to make that decision and 90 days to pull it off.
And now it worked out for the best, or?
Awesome. It's just been the most amazing thing. Because I knew there's certain things, I have skills and all that I've acquired and knowledge that I'm supposed to share with others, and I didn't, and I can support myself doing it. And I kind of knew that's what God will I do, but I want to take a more mainstream, safe thing. So I got into very mainstream landscaping, and that's very serious business in Naples. And I ended up, landscaping for bankers and all these elite gated communities. And there's just a lot of regulations and a lot of headaches. And just the whole place is so packed full of people. And it just my life was becoming a complete nightmare. And that was one thing I had to take a leap of faith. I'm going to do what's best for my soul. And if I end up working at the feed store or something, so be it, and I decided to try to do coaching or whatever of the farming concepts and all that it's kind of an invention of mine. And some crazy stuff happened with the properties and whatnot. I ended up with 10 acres, and then, I'm like waiting for Dusty to say it. I've ended up letting him make decisions because I don't know how he knows some of these things. Or like he has some kind of a prophetic sense at sometimes. I mean, he knows things sometimes he shouldn't know. And every time that I think I knew better, I would think I knew better, and I would go against him. It ended up badly for me. So I figure just the male sense of certain things. I mean, he's
Are
got.
you listening to this, ladies? You listen to the male sense. The male sense. We know what's right.
Yes.
We know what's right. This is
There's certain things when it comes to like getting the basics in place first,
Sure.
and now we do this. You can't go from point A to point Z. I know you want to. You can't decorate the house before we build it. These are all things that I'd like to say, I've got this and other women don't, but yeah, it's been a huge headache. It's stress for him, but I have really nearly given him a mental collapse, but we finally got it sorted out and figured out. And a lot of things I just say, okay, and he's engineered the farm thing is developed into this very big thing. I ended up with 10 acres that I never would have dreamed of. I ended up going to mass every day, something I never would have dreamed of. I mean, the move has brought things that are so good. It was beyond my imagination. And we're very much on track to start a small dairy and cheese making facility, which is something he's been talking about I know he's from Wisconsin, but he's been talking about this for years. And like it was just going to happen. And I'm like, yeah, well, whatever. And then all of a sudden, well, I bought the 10 acres, thought I would have to sell some. But, if you start the dairy, you could probably keep the whole thing. And next thing you know, this whole thing fell in place. That's, I don't want to go off describing my business, but it's an amazing thing where one thing leans on the other, and on paper, the profit margins look great. So even if it does 60% of what it looks like, well, I will be fine.
And so real quick, as you say, I mean, we probably don't want to go too long into your business, but it sounds like an interesting concept. So you're doing some sort of coaching for like natural farming, or what is that?
Well, I have my own kind of a semi-permaculture design where you grow like 80% of your own food in this very tight system that actually integrates with your landscaping. I was going to just do coaching. That was a thing. Well, and I probably will, but it's more now towards installation on other people's places, like the grow box. If you want a vegetable garden, you don't have time, I will set it up and we'll do it like lawn care with a special growing medium that is actually produced by, believe it or not, ducks and the goats, and then special minerals that are to balance, certain balance of minerals to make these like the ideal fruits and vegetables. And we'll do the same thing with fruit trees because I have a nursery license and I am a landscaper. And I still do landscaping. I did a landscape job for a family at the parish, and I just taken a break. But landscaping, fruit trees, that's actually the same thing. So, I get the trees from the huge wholesale nurseries and stuff that a person on the street can't even go in there. You have to have a business. You have to have, So I got in my experience in Naples, so I brought that with me. Because I was very much in there batting it with the rest of them, pulling trailers around Miami into these huge wholesale nurseries and stuff. And so I brought all my stuff with me. But now it's be more towards growing food. And then I do the shrines. That's something I've always done. And I'm very much looking forward to starting to do shrines, like tile, like a couple different types. I've been doing that since I was a child, and it's here, I should be able to share that. And then I grow a certain kind of plants from Elliott. It's ornamental pineapples, but till you see them, you can't believe what they're like. And you can literally stick them between two rocks. They're air plants. And I brought 700 of them up from Naples. And so it's a little nursery of them. Maybe it's not filled up Maybe it's kind of big nursery. I don't know. But between that and the production of the growing medium, and now actually getting to be a grade A dairy, I have spent hours and hours getting all the government regulations and everything exactly right. The equipment, it's huge to do a grade A dairy. And so I refined my cheese making skills. These are all things I grew up doing and that I know. Of course, I'd refine some of it, but it's a good life, and it's just that making the most of your land and the most of your property, and it's a good life, and that's why it's SJB Abundance Farms is in honor of St. Joseph, or St. John Bosco, who, by the way, ties in with the prison thing because St. Joseph the Vessel, the saint of the prisoners, was actually the mentor of St. John Bosco, and St. John Bosco went in the prisons, and his calling was to reach these boys before they went to prison. So I see all of these young traditional Catholics, and you say, don't look at the TV, don't spend hours playing video games. What are you supposed to do? I grew up doing all this. I was homeschooled. Thankfully, my parents were into survivalism, so that was why. They got out of that subdivision when I was 8, and, I had the goats, I had inedible weeds, all this life. And then I found out some families that lived in town, and I'm like, good grief, that must be like growing up in prison. And you don't watch TV, you don't play video games, what do you do? Sit there and look at the wall like you're in solitary confinement? There's a lot of temptation. Do something, or everything else just something nonsense to burn up your time. Whereas growing your own food, it's a win on every front. So that's why it's St. John Bosco is the patron.
What was the name of the site again?
The what? SJB Abundance Farms.
One more time.
SJB for St. John Bosco, Abundance Farms.
Abundance Farms, got it.
It's under construction, but it's pretty good. It's presentable.
I know about websites are a nightmare, so I know all about under construction. Websites are always under construction, right? That is the truth. That's interesting. That sounds like a really interesting idea.
Shout out to Jason Guardiano, who is my web designer. He works with True Restoration, and he is awesome. And his patience is really awesome, too.
Good to know. All right. I want to remember his name if I ever need a website again, because someone would need a holy soul to work with me.
Yes.
For sure. No, that's awesome. It's really, really fascinating. It sounds like you need to do some like web series of videoing some of your ideas. They sound really interesting. It's kind of hard to picture, but boy, you put it on camera. Wow.
Yeah, we do have future goals because my head is a fountain of ideas, and Dusty is like a freight train engine. He never stops. He's like a beaver. He's working on something. His time is all taken. And there is a nonprofit in the offing. It's kind of taking place and taking form of something. We want to promote lay people living the life that we were called to live, not being that, lay people are supposed to be just worldly and what can I get by with, and is it a sin? No, what are we really supposed to do? What's the best we can do? If we want to stay in society, let's be what God really wills us to be, and let's find out what that is, because I've had a lot to figure that out, because my mother went into this kind of extreme austerity stuff that wasn't really right, and it did not do me good spiritually. So there was like this extreme, and you run into that with the Feniites, and she was a Feniite. So you run into that, and then you run into this, just be a normal person, you live for fun and fashion, and we're supposed to have a purpose for everything we do, even our recreation. It's supposed to rest us so we can serve God better. It's not, I gave some money in the collection, I've done some good works, now I get to have fun. That's misusing God's creation. It is a sin. But to sort through, and that's one thing I'm doing with my conversations with priests, is discussing the things that I know this can't be right, but this is the common mentality. So we'll take a process of working, you know, to really define what are we supposed to do? What is the ideal way for a woman to dress at church? You know, it's not tell me, oh, it's not a sin. That's not a reason to do something. What is the very best thing for us to do? And then what can we do for society in capacity as a lay person? What are the parameters when we're crossing a line we don't belong? Or what could we do if we're well prepared, if we need to be better prepared, or if we can work with the clergy? You know, like in the past, mission countries, there was a lot of need. They had lay catechists, but the priest made sure the catechist was well prepared. You know, so we don't want to, you know, proliferate all these people that just came in from Mars and now they're teaching catechism online and everywhere, making a mess of things. We don't want to promote that, but yet we're, you know, it's just like if there's a big wreck in front of your house and there's people laying in the street bleeding, do you walk in the house and start watching TV because, not watching TV, but doing whatever, because I'm not a paramedic or a doctor? You do what you can. And if this is a war and it's happening habitually, what do? You educate yourself in first aid so that you can do it better. And it's what I feel like spiritually, it's a disaster. And people tend to want to make this little narrow, traditional Catholic ideal box. But you know what? If we don't reach out to the society, it's going to smash that box. And we're all going to die. We have to, you know, I think that happened in Europe with the Germanic tribes. You know, the Latins got a little too comfortable. Well, why weren't the Germanic tribes being maybe a little more effort to convert them? I realized that one time. No, they were barbarians. They weren't half human, I think. It was probably the mindset, you know, those things. What did God do? Well, he sent them to your back door. Your backyard. And what happened? You converted them. You know, Europe got destroyed, and it was not a pleasant experience, but they got evangelized. If you wouldn't go to them, God sent them to you, and it's not going to be pleasant. So we can make our little enclaves, and we can forget the society exists, but all you need to look at is the militancy of the gay and lesbian stuff, and you think they're not coming for you. You're being labeled as cruel, savage, destructive. We are being labeled that, and the only way to turn that tide is to convert the people. It's like, you talk about the Jews and all the funding. What happens? I just saw Disney were getting a little too forward with their gay and lesbian stuff. They lost 50% of their funding. Profits went down 50% because they crossed the line the American people won't look at it. So it's for us to raise the standard by simply converting the people and doing our best. And you just do that by whatever God has called you to do. Really do what God wills you to do.
Well, one of the most influential experiences or moments of my life, when I was at a boys' camp, and Father Anaya gave a talk to the maybe 50, 60 boys. And I don't remember the whole sermon. I remember the point of it was to be the light of the world. Mm-hmm. And that line really stuck with me, and it's 17, 18 years ago at this point. And it really is stuck because that's really exactly what you're saying. It's not just to get through. It's not just to get by. It's not just to you know, pay our dues. It is to be the light of the world, because if we are and we do what we can, what we're actually able to, and what God made us to do, there really is no stopping us. It really is just a matter of will and doing.
Yeah, and God has this path mapped out, and that's something I really felt with. I think I didn't have enough faith to share this farm and general lifestyle thing and to pursue that. So I went into this very mainstream landscaping business, you know, like I went into just that aspect. And I honestly, the way my life the last couple of years, I felt like Jonas. And I think that was why. I mean, if your life is going like Jonah's life was there for a while, you know, you might need to look, are you doing, because only you know what God has called you to do. You know what your talents are. You know where your place in the world. You know what you're drawn to. You know what for you is spiritually good or bad. I had to say working with the prisoners was always very good for me spiritually. It wasn't something where well, I sacrificed my soul for something to save someone else's. For me, it was a good thing. The landscaping business was not, and it was starting to run into, elite vanity level stuff that I would be like, I don't really feel right about this. I mean, plants that were turning into collector's items. I mean, like, is it really right to spend this much money on this plant really that much better than the other one? I mean, do we really need? And next thing you know, it was, no, my house, $3 million house, and well, when I put the pool in, I want you to do the pottery, and I'm like, I can just see these realtors all whining and dining and drinking their martinis around the pool, and I've got it decorated. I'm like, I don't belong here. It wasn't good for my soul. So you always think your own personal soul first, and then what's your highest contribution to society as a job, and and then if you can, when it comes to recreation too, is there something you can do that contributes? You need some recreation, and then what do you have to offer? For some, it may be, some people are introverts, some people are extroverts, some people, they know what they can handle. Everybody can't handle riding the prisoners. You've got to be somebody that can handle very intense situations. But it might be an old lady, maybe she can embroider. Instead of embroidering daisies on a pillowcase, embroider vestments. Imagine if we all start doing whatever God told us personally to do. We're not all Joan of Arc, but Joan of Arc had to do. I'm just reading her story now, and it's kind of a hard read, honestly, because you love to have that fabulous ending, and people are just so nasty. Even the people on your side many times are so nasty. But, in the end, the glory of God. And I think perhaps when people were praying a lot, and then when they smelled victory, maybe they stopped praying, for the French people. Because you got to keep it up. You can do nothing by yourself. It's all prayer, God's grace. And without we can do everything.
Yep, and I think that I think that's a perfect place to end it. I think that ending it on doing God's will, and what else can be said. And I really appreciate it. I mean, I think it's been a really interesting and again, subject that nobody really talks about. So again, warning, as you said, to anyone who's interested in that, really think about it. Maybe talk to your priest about it. No, I wouldn't just do it if you're older, for sure. But if you're younger and you're watching this, take it easy a little bit. Talk to a priest, talk to your parents, especially if you're with your parents. But I mean, it's something people should consider at least, and have it on their.
The biggest thing is to make sure you're very well prepared spiritually in your knowledge of the faith, and that goes for being on social media or anything. That would be my biggest caution: is don't just jump in and make a mess.
Good idea. And that's life in general, right?
Yes.
Don't jump in and make a mess. I like it. Amanda Schmitt's last words. Amanda, I really appreciate it. Maybe one of these days we'll have you on again. We'll talk. Well, maybe I'd be really interested to see some videos of what you have planned. I mean, some of your outside stuff, some of your your consulting, or your. Because I mean, I think that's, as you say, it's really important, and it's important to. As we see society collapse around us, I mean, I see every day Germany is going to, gas is going to be a nightmare because Russia shut off the gas pipelines. I'm in Germany here. It's not looking good. It looks like we may have no energy this winter if it's a harsh winter. So it is time for us to, I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but it's time for us to start thinking very seriously about.
Because if we don't, it's going to be the end of the world.
That is the truth. Awesome. Amanda, thank you so much. Until next time, God bless you.
Okay, thank you so much.